the age of deceptive sensuality and pretentiousness-driven ideas, one might seek to watch a film that makes some room for reflection, remembering, and insight. Persona by Bergman is one of those films. The film's story is about a nurse, Alma, who has to take care of her patient Elizabeth. Elizabeth is a successful actress, but suddenly she felt silent and lethargic during one of her acting performances named Electra. She wasn't involved in any dialogue with anyone, even though she was healthy. At the film's beginning, we can assume there's the Electra complex, which is related to Carl Jung's conception of emotional constellations and is an analogy to the Oedipus complex. So the idea behind the Electra's complex is that a girl sees her father as the object to obtain, and the mother is the one that is interfering, causing jealousy and competition. Even though the film's name has the same name as one of Jung's developed concepts, Bernstein reflected in his book Films and Dreams on psychological interpretation. In the case of Persona, all questions about the legitimization of any device, even at the moment it has been identified as a device, reoccur because we have to ask ourselves who condenses, who displaces, and who distorts. From a Freudian mouth, the answer would come spontaneously. The devices are effectuated by the ego, the id, or the superego. However, in Persona, it is none of the three in particular, but it is just the film itself. So let's take a stop and not jump to Jung's ideas, but use a psychoanalytical view to look at Bergman's film, Persona. The psychological constructs that are used to understand a person might shed some light on the convergence of those two characters that are shown in the film. Alma has a tendency to be communicative. She loves her husband. She aims to build a family.
Jag gifter mig med Karl-Henrik och vi får ett par barn som jag ska uppfostra. Allt det där är bestämt, det finns inne i mig. Det är ingenting att grubbla över det.
Her time spent with Elizabeth is what reveals her inadequacies and internally harbored contradictions.
Och så får man dåligt samvete för små saker. Nu kan du förstå det. När blir det med allting man förutsätter? Är det inte alls nödvändigt att göra det?
For example, Alma's confession about her adultery despite her love for her husband, after which she got pregnant but didn't want a child at that moment, even though now she does. Throughout the whole movie, Alma engages Elizabeth in dialogue, and based on Freud, the word is the foundation of assessing someone's psyche, as language being part of the ego allows us to understand and become conscious of our underlying processes. So the use of language in this film, mainly used by Alma, reveals a therapeutic process, as in psychoanalysis. But regardless, we do see a disconnect between word meanings and behavior, revealing the representation of Alma through limitation of drives. Now, Elizabeth in the film is characterized by the absence of speaking, so in her interaction with Alma, Elizabeth's personality is noted with behavior and observation. The psychologist assessing her noted her intentions as a mask to not have a mask.
Man kan stänga in sig och skärma av. Behöver man ju inte spela några roller, visa några ansikten eller göra några falska gester. Tror man. Men så är verkligheten jävlas.
There is that notion that masks allow us to orient ourselves in the world. It is noted in psychoanalysis we will not be able to take everything into consciousness, and processes will occur behind our stage without our awareness. So the psychologist gave Elizabeth a mask, and so did Alma. The psychologist thought that she would change her mask, but Alma that there's a judgment-free friendship between them. However, Alma's notion of their friendship was broken in the middle of the movie, when she read Elizabeth's letter about the interesting observations she made while living with Alma. What put Elizabeth into words was fear. When Alma was about to spill boiling water on her during their conflict, or when Elizabeth was made to talk by Alma.
Ingenting.
Maybe that nothing isn't really nothing from the perspective of language, and is a way that Elizabeth was able to come back from her illness considering is nearing the end of the film. We find out that her motherhood was supported not by motherly instinct, but by a social role in her contingencies, leading her to contempt for her child. But regardless, there's no discontinuity between Elizabeth's behavior and words, as there are no words. She could be represented as more primal tendencies, a sort of regressed state, which is not only characterized by the absence of masks, even though others have the ability to assign them, but also by the ability to reveal the inconsistencies that are related to Alma. There are comparisons with one and the same person that are placed throughout the film. At the film's beginning, where we see the image of both women in front of the child, by the summer house, Alma's and Elizabeth's hands are compared.
Betyder otur att jämföra henne, vet inte det.
In the dream, Elizabeth and Alma look at the same mirror, the same reflection. What is the clearest of this merging of two distinct characters into unity is when Elizabeth's husband considers Alma as Elizabeth.
Nej, var inte så ängslig men älskade. Vi har ju varann. Vi har förtroende för varann. Vi känner varandras tankar. Vi älskar varann. Det är ju så intressant.
Och det viktiga är själva ansträngningen, inte vad vi åstadkommer, eller hur?
In the end, it is Alma the one that tells Elizabeth's causal story and not Elizabeth.
Elisabeth, du äger nästan allting i din utrustning, som kvinna och som konstnär. Men du saknar moderlighet.
This shows the dichotomy of the same being, but yet with very different approaches to one another. Now, glancing at those descriptions of Alma, Elizabeth, and their unity, we can look back at Freud's constructs. The power of the id expresses the true purpose of the individual organism's life. This consists in the satisfaction of its innate needs. The superego may bring fresh needs to the fore, but its main function remains the delimitation of satisfactions. An action by the ego is as it should be if it satisfies simultaneously the demands of the id, of the superego, and of reality. That is to say, if it is able to reconcile their demands with one another. Now let's take the reality aspect of the ego as the actual output, since we're able to see the film. And how do we see those constructs? Alma with her rules, or words, is equivalent to the superego construct, which is reasonable as language is heavily embedded within the customs of a particular culture. Elizabeth with her tendency to dispense those rules and causing to reveal the inconsistency within them, the id, and their unity, the ego, and isn't the unity birth? As Jung said, your blood will stream from many wounds in this frightful struggle. Your shock and doubt will be great, but from such torment the new life will be born. Birth is blood and torment. Now, taking a look at those three structures and how they interact reveal a fractal pattern. We can see that the ego construct reveals the relationship of two forces of the same being. So, Alma and Elizabeth are shown as the same person, but yet there's the same construct in effect in those very characters themselves. Alma's rules aren't going in accordance with her past drives, and resolution we see in her manifest language, which connects both, as in Confessions. Elizabeth had the mask of a loving mother. Her motherliness was at peril since her new responsibility was a threat to her acting career, and she coped with both through appearing without any mask by being mute, isolated, and taken care of. The ego could be the explanation of the scenes themselves, where there is a representation of certainty or rules in one scene, and the following scene of approaching threat to those rules, and the ego is the resolution of those two forces. For example, Alma is a nurse and has her obligations. She doesn't want to take care of her patient to begin with, as she sees it as a threat, but eventually we see the interaction of both forces in the forthcoming scene. So the question is, isn't this thesis, antithesis, and synthesis at work? How does an interpretation aspect play a part in it? For example, let's change the sides a little bit. What if Elizabeth is the representation of the superego and the strict rules? Maybe the non-speech approach is the new rule rather than the omission of it. Then how does Alma represent the id? Control? Whoever you consider is wearing a mask in this film, or let's call it what it is, persona. Its changes function as an adaptation to the real world.